Chapter 7, Section 1, Segregation, Discrimination. And what this first slide shows, and this is in the book, also on page 185, it shows the impact that some of these voting laws had on African American voting turnout. So you see that in 1876, when Reconstruction was still happening, had nearly 100% voter turnout, and by 1896, which would have been Plessy versus Ferguson, it's closer to 10%. So from this first section, how did whites create a segregated society in the South and how African Americans responded? So that's kind of a two-parter. And then analyze efforts to limit immigration, and then compare the situations of Mexican Americans and women to those of other groups. So you've got Jim Crow laws, which are these segregation laws passed in the South after Reconstruction, poll tax, which the voters required to pay to vote, the literacy test, that's the quiz that I gave you that was an example of a voting literacy test. Grandfather clause was a law basically passed that prevented African Americans from being able to vote because the only way you could vote is if you had an ancestor who had voted prior to 1866, which slaves wouldn't have had any. So, and then you've got African American leaders, and these were the leaders that responded and kind of how they responded. So you've got Booker T. Washington, who promotes what is called accommodation. W.E. Du Bois was agitation, and then Ida B. Wells would have fallen into that agitation realm. But she did a lot of her protesting through newspapers and editorials. And Las Gorras Blancas was a group of Mexican Americans who protested their loss of land in the Southwest. How were civil and political rights of certain groups in America undermined during the years after Reconstruction? You got all kinds of things going on. One is, again, probably a lack of leadership from Washington, D.C., but you see a number of laws being enacted at the state level, and even when these get challenged at the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court isn't able to respond and react the way that I guess in today's society you would have expected them to. But they kind of rule in favor of these, and they prefer to leave it to the state and local control. And so sometimes this period of time is also called the nadir period because it's so brutal on the civil rights of minority groups. So if we look at ways in which blacks' rights to vote was restricted once federal troops were removed in the South in 1876, that's where you see the poll taxes, the literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and then you also see white supremacist groups using violence to intimidate people. And then segregation via Jim Crow laws became the norm, and African Americans lost voting rights. So, between these two things where states are passing laws that that limit voting and the use of violence to intimidate voters, you also have these Jim Crow laws that keep the two groups segregated. So in addition to losing voting rights, they also are segregated in the South and the North. And so you have Plessy versus Ferguson, which upholds the ability to have these Jim Crow laws and these segregation laws. But African Americans refuse to accept this status, and you see several important leaders emerge and call for equality. But you also see African Americans, for example, Plessy steps up to bat and is willing to challenge this Louisiana law and to take it to the Supreme Court. So even the Plessy versus Ferguson case shows the leadership and the fact that African Americans are refusing to accept this and that they're willing to go through legal channels to try and change it. So Booker T. Washington is arguably one of the most famous. He and W.E. Du Bois probably emerge as the two most prominent leaders of the African American community. And so Booker T. Washington pushes what he calls accommodation, where instead of like protesting and maybe using violence, and he would rather see African Americans make themselves economically necessary. So learn some skills, learn some trades, and then once you build up enough economic resources, you're going to be able to then use your position in the economy to kind of get change to take place. W. Du Bois is good friends with Booker T. Washington, and they do agree on some things, but they do disagree on this. W. Du Bois believes that African Americans should more agitate and stand up and exert their rights, and maybe make white Americans a little uncomfortable about their treatment of African Americans. And so that you shouldn't just wait and sit back. You need to kind of get other people to realize that these things need to happen. And then Ida B. Wells, she spends a lot of her time devoted to the anti-lynching campaign, and she does a lot of writing to do that. But she does other things too, especially with education. She was a teacher, and she kind of uses that background in both her writing as an editor and also as her speeches. And she's really educating or attempting to educate both whites and blacks about what's going on and what needs to be done. Mexican Americans always struggle against discrimination, and even to this day in the Southwest. For whatever reason, people tend to forget that Hispanics have been in the southwestern part of the United States for well over 500 years now. So it's kind of ironic that when you have these immigration laws, they're stopping the people who are most likely to have been there for 500 years versus the people who are most likely to have only been there 100. But when they get these treaties of Guadalupe, they're able to kind of push Hispanic Americans off of their land, and that's going to continue again, where we're going to talk about other instances where the federal government passes laws and takes lands from Hispanic Americans and leaves the whites alone. So that discrimination has been around for a long time. And then Chinese immigrants also face racial prejudice in the West at this time. There are quite a few laws in California specifically, but also in Washington and Oregon that prevent Chinese Americans from owning or getting jobs. And then you also get the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevents Chinese laborers from coming into the country. And then you also see women who are pushing for a reform movement. They want women's rights, especially the right to vote. Women were pretty disappointed when African Americans got rights and women didn't. And so you get these leaders who emerge, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they really push for the women's right to vote. Susan B. Anthony voted in an election and was arrested, and she kind of used that waiting for a trial period to deliver a powerful speech on the issue. And it's really not until after World War II, or World War I, excuse me, where women are allowed to vote. And a lot of that has to do with President Wilson being able to make a pretty strong argument that women were willing to risk their husbands and their fathers and their sons for a country that wouldn't let them vote. The least this country could do is allow them to vote in an election. And that was a pretty effective argument, and it was kind of hard for people to disagree at that point.